The Lord be with you and good day. I am KMC, and in this video, I am going to discuss Chapter 10, which is all about the basic principles of lessee accounting and lease accounting in general. So, I will be recording this chapter with my group mates, Michelle A. Añasco and Rizel Ann Espiritu. So, I'll be handling the first part, so let's get started. So the objectives of this chapter is number one, to know the optional application of operating lease on the part of the lessee. Number two, to recognize a right of use and lease liability in a finance lease. Number three, to understand the measurement of a right of use asset. And four, to understand the measurement of a lease liability in a finance lease. So, the applicable accounting standard for this topic is IFRS 16, which is actually a new lease standard. Siya yung pumalit sa IAS 17. So let us first define a lease. So a lease is defined as a contract or part of a contract that conveys the right to use the underlying asset for a period of time in exchange for consideration. So the first part na na-highlight ay contract or part of a contract. So ibig sabihin, maaaring ang contract or agreement ay para lang talaga sa lease. Halimbawa, upahan ng bahay, yun lang yung laman ng agreement. Pwede namang part lang siya ng isa pang mas malaking kontrata na marami pang ibang agreements na nilalaman. No? Kumbaga, kasali lang siya. So, next naman, na-highlight natin ay for a period of time. Ibig sabihin, meron tayong tinatawag na lease term. Hindi siya panghabang buhay. No? And lastly, in exchange for consideration. So, ibig sabihin nito, si lessee, or mamaya magtakal natin yan, yung nangungupahan, magbabayad siya kapalit nung makukuha niyang benefit. Kasi kung hindi siya magbabayad, edi hindi na siya qualified under lease accounting. So, magiging donation na siya. So, ito naman, right to use the underlying asset will be elaborating it later on. But tandaan natin yan. So, before tayo magpalalim sa topic na to, tingnan muna natin yung parties involved. So, I think we're all familiar dito sa mga to. So, the first one ay lessor, who provides the right to use. Next naman, yung lessee, who obtains the right to use. So siya naman yung nangungupahan. Siya naman kumbaga yung customer ng lessor. So, ang tawag naman sa pinagkakasunduan nilang bagay ay underlying asset or it is the subject of the lease. So, nabanggit yan kanina yung underlying asset. Yun yung pinagkakasunduan nila na asset. Halimbawa nga na building, machineries, equipment, or kung ano-ano pa. Okay, so nabanggit natin kanina yung right to use. So, at sabi, sa standard na to, para may consider na lease, dapat magkaroon ng right to control the use of asset yung lessee or yung customer. So, itakil natin yon. Ano ba muna yung asset na tinutukoy dito sa right to control the use of an asset? So, yung una, dapat siya ay isang identified asset. Ibig sabihin, tukoy yung asset na papaupahan. Hindi pwedeng wala lang, hindi sigurado or hindi determined yung asset na papaupahan. So, it is either explicitly identified or implicitly identified. So, pag sinabi natin explicitly expressed, nasa agreement talaga siya, nasa kontrata talaga siya. Kapag naman implicitly, it is identified once it is made available for use of the customer or the lessee. So, kumbaga pag ginawa siyang available para sa lessee, then parang implied na okay, ito yung asset under our agreement kahit hindi siya nakalagay sa kontrata. Next naman, paano natin masasabi na merong right to control the use of asset yung lessee? So, the customer or the lessee should have the right to obtain, number one, obtain substantially all of the economic benefits from the use directly or indirectly. So, dapat makinabang siya, no? In simple term, dapat pakinabangan niya. Meron siyang karapatan na pakinabangan yung underlying asset na yun. Halimbawa, gagamitin niya sa business or kung personal use man yan. But dito sa data na natin, for business siya, no? So, meron siyang exclusive use. Ibig sabihin, siya lang yung pwedeng gumamit nun. Wala nang ibang parties pa na hindi naman kasali sa kontrata. So, meron siyang exclusive use. Number two, the customer or lessee should have the right to direct the use of the asset. So, dapat siya yung magdidikta paano at para saan niya magagamitin to. Kunwari nga ay sa business, di ba? Kung gagamitin niyang stock room, kung gagamitin niya naman office, di ba? Siya yung bahala. So, kung meron siya nitong dalawang to, number one, and ito, direct use, ibig sabihin, meron siyang right to control the use of an asset. And doon natin masasabi na under na itong agreement nito ng isang lease. Okay. So, dako naman tayo sa lease model. So, lease model, ito yung basihan kung paano ba i-account ni lessee nasa point of view tayo ni Lessee or yung customer, yung nangungupahan, paano ba i-account ni Lessee yung transactions niya under this lease, no? Yung mga binabayad niya, paano niya ba i-record? So, meron tayong dalawang options, which are finance lease and operating lease. Sa IAS 17, malaya yung lessee na pumili kung aling model ba yung gagamitin. But under IFRS 16, itong finance lease, yung used by default. So kumbaga sa law, it is the general rule na kailangan sundin. Magkakaroon lang ng option na gamitin ng operating lease under two optional exceptions. Maalin dito sa dalawang ito. So kapag short-term lease or low-value lease, may option si lessee na gamitin ang operating lease model. Optional lang siya. Kahit papasok sa short-term, kahit pasok sa low-value lease, nasa option pa rin kung mag-finance lease man siya, allowed pa din. Okay? So, yun yung i-highlight natin dito. Overview lang to, himayin natin to sa following slides. So let's start with finance lease model. So finance lease model is the default model to be used under the new lease standard. It requires the lessee to recognize a right of use asset and a lease liability at the commencement date. When we say commencement date, ito yung date kung kailan nagsimulang magkaroon ng right si lessee doon sa underlying asset. So, kailan niya ba pwedeng i-exercise yung right na yun? So, dapat mag-recognize siya ng asset and liability. So, hindi ko na ito muna palalalinan kasi siya yung topic sa mga kasunod. But, ang usual na example nito ay yung mga rent to own. So, meron option yung lessee na bilhin or magkaroon ng transfer of ownership sa dulo noong lease agreement or lease term. Okay, so next we have operating lease model. So it is permitted to be used by the lessee through an accounting policy election, provided that the lease is short-term or the underlying asset is of low value. Again, optional to. Kahit papasok siya sa dalawa, kung gusto ni lessee na finance lease, edi yun ang gagamitin niya. Kasi yun naman talaga yung stated sa standard. If operating lease model will be used, the lessee shall recognize lease payments as an expense. Hindi katulad sa finance lease, merong asset, merong liability. So, expense siya in, number 1, straight line basis over the lease term, or 2, other systematic basis yung gagamitin. Kapag straight line basis over the lease term, ibig sabihin nun, kung 3 years yung term, tapos 10,000 kada buwan yung nasimulan mong bayaran, over the term, ganun na yung i-recognize as expense, 10,000 a month. So, ito naman, letter B, other systematic basis, ginagamit lang siya kapag mas representative or mas reliable yung representation ng magagawa niya kung paano ba nagbe-benefit si lessee doon sa underlying asset. So, kadalasan, straight line basis pa rin talaga ang ginagamit. So let us talk about naman optional exemptions. Itong short-term lease and low-value lease. So when we say short-term lease, it has a term of 12 months or less at the commencement date of the lease. So the election for this kind of lease shall be made by a class of underlying asset. So when we say class of underlying asset, it is a grouping ng asset ng isang entity na mayroong similar nature and use doon sa operations ng entity. So if the lease has a purchase option, it is not considered a short-term lease. So kahit pa tumama sa 12 months or less yan, basta may purchase option at transfer of ownership sa dulo, hindi siya pwede under short-term lease. Kasi sabi ko nga, pag mga rent-to-own, sa finance lease yun. Okay, number 2, low-value lease. Ang basis dito, usually, akalain natin may amount na given, but the standard didn't give a fixed amount as threshold. So, professional judgment lang yung gagamitin para malaman if low value ba yung lease or hindi. So, assessment is done based on the value of asset when it is new, regardless of the asset's age. So, ibig sabihin, kung may sasakyan na 5 years nang ginagamit, ang i-consider doon ay kung magkano ba siya nabili noong bago pa siya. Hindi na baliwala yung 5 years. So, yun yung basihan. Election is made on a lease-by-lease basis. So, ayun nga, walang sinabi si standard na fixed amount kasi nga, babago yan sa iba't ibang sitwasyon. Depende sa underlying asset at depende doon sa nature ng transaction. So, hanggang dito na lang yung aking i-discuss. My other group mates will be discussing the other parts of this topic. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Kay. Ngayon naman, let's discuss finance lease in the part of the lessee. So, tandaan po natin na lessee po yung pinag-uusapan natin dito at hindi ang lessor. Una, ano nga ba yung finance lease? Yung finance lease po is a type of lease that transfers substantially all of the risks and rewards incidental to ownership of an underlying asset. So, kapag sinabi natin transfer substantially, ibig sabihin, nag-transfer tayo ng malaking portion, almost all, or mga 90% ng ng risks and rewards. So ano na nga ba yung risks and rewards? Sa rewards po, for example, binigyan ka ng right to use sa asset na yon and then nagagamit mo siya sa operations ng iyong business and kumikita ka sa business mo. So ganun po yung mga rewards. Ibig sabihin, nagbe-benefit ka or nagbe-benefit yung business mo. Halimbawa, yung business mo ay nangungupahan sa space. So kung wala yung space na yon, hindi mag-exist yung business mo at hindi ka rin naman kikita. So kapag ganun, walang rewards na matatanggap. So, ayun po yan. On the other hand, yung risks naman po, for example, yung space na inuupahan ng business mo ay prone sa baha or any other calamities. Halimbawa din nito yung kapag nalulugi na yung business mo na nangungupahan doon sa space na yun. So, risk yun para sa business mo. So, kapag ba nag-transfer tayo ng malaking portion ng risks and rewards, ibig sabihin finance lease na? No po, dahil dapat yung risks and rewards ay incidental to ownership of an underlying asset. So, nabanggit na ni Kay kanina kung ano yung underlying asset. Ito yung subject of a lease. Then nabanggit rin ni Kay kanina na yung all leases shall be accounted for by the lessee as finance lease. So, nakasulat kasi yon sa under the new lease standard which is the IFRS 16. Then, ano-ano yung mga dapat i-recognize ni lessee at the commencement date? So, si lessee ay dapat mag-recognize ng right of use asset and lease liability na matatakal natin sa next slides. Right of use asset, ano nga ba to? Ito yung asset that represents the right of a lessee to use an underlying asset over the lease term. So ito yung asset, the specific machinery, equipment, building, na nagre-represent doon sa right ng lessee na magamit yung underlying asset over the lease term. So lease term, ito yung period na kung saan si lessee ay may right to use the underlying asset. So under the finance lease, instead of machinery, equipment, building, yung gagamitin natin, yung proper term na gagamitin natin ay right of use asset. Paano naman i-measure ni lessee yung right of use asset at the commencement date? So under IFRS 16 paragraph 23, sinasabi dito na si lessee ay dapat i-measure yung right of use asset at cost. Gaya po ng nabanggit ko kanina, yung initial measurement po of right of use asset ay at cost. At ang cost na yan po ay nag-i-include ng mga sumusunod. Una ay yung present value ng lease payments or yung tinatawag nating initial measurement of the lease liability. So di ba po magbabayad si lessee kay lessor ng mga lease payments and dapat naka-present value yon dahil mahabang panahon po yung pinag-uusapan natin dito. Kasi kung less than 1 year lang naman po yon ay hindi naman po magmamatter yung present value. Then the next one naman is yung lease payments made to lessor at or before commencement date. So, meron po kasing lease payments na binabayaran si lessee kay lessor aside from the first one na nabanggit ko. So, example po nito ay yung lease bonus. So, yung lease bonus po, ito po yung kumbaga padulas. So, syempre, minsan po maraming gustong magrenta sa isang property na yan and para ikaw yung piliin ng lessor, there might be additional payment po before mag-start yung lease. Then, last any lease incentives or reimbursement. So, idinadadak po natin yung lease incentives kasi po, ito po yung mga lease payments na ibinabalik ni lessor kay lessee associated with the lease. Next naman po, nakasama sa cost ng right of use asset ay yung initial direct costs incurred by the lessee. So yung initial direct cost po ay yung mga incremental cost of obtaining a lease. And hindi po rito kasama yung leasehold improvements, executory cost, and refundable security deposit. So yung leasehold improvements po kasi ay tinitreat natin as asset under the PPE. While yung executory cost naman po ay mga ownership expenses such as maintenance, taxes, and insurance for the underlying asset na ina-expense po immediately when incurred. And yung refundable security deposit naman po, from the term refundable, ibig sabihin, ma-receive po natin siya at the end of the lease term. So, tinitreat natin siya as receivable. Next naman po ay ang estimated cost of dismantling, removing, and restoring the underlying asset for which the lessee has a present obligation. So kapag may pinalitan ka, kapag may inalis ka, tinanggal ka, or nirestore ka doon sa underlying asset na yun, so kasama siya doon sa cost ng right of use asset. Then let's take a look on this slide para ma-visualize nyo kung paano ba yung computation ng cost of right of use asset. Just pause the video para mas ma-check nyo siya ng maigi. So tapos na tayo sa initial measurement ng right of use asset. Ngayon naman, subsequent measurement. So under IFRS 16 paragraph 29, the lessee shall measure the right of use asset applying the cost model. So meaning yung carrying amount ng ating right of use asset is equal to costs less any accumulated depreciation less any accumulated impairment loss. And lagi nating tatandaan na yung carrying amount is adjusted for any remeasurement of the lease liability. So kapag nag-remeasure ka ng lease liability, asahan mo na magre-remeasure ka rin ng carrying amount kasi yung lease liability is part ng cost ng right of use asset. Other measurement models, fair value model and revaluation model. So una, yung fair value model. So pwedeng i-apply ni Lessee yung fair value model kapag yung right of use asset niya ay nami-meet yung definition ng investment property. So since fair value model to, yung right of use asset dapat natin dito ay nasa fair value. While yung revaluation model naman dito, binibigyan lang tayo ng option na gumamit ng revaluation model kapag yung right of use asset natin is related with property, plant, and equipment. Presentation of right of use asset. So under paragraph 47 of IFRS 16, si lessee ay dapat i-present yung right of use asset as a separate line item in the statement of financial position under the non-current assets. However, as an alternative, the lessee may include the right of use asset in the appropriate line item plus disclosure in the notes to financial statement. So appropriate line item, for example, PPE siya. So sa PPE siya. Then disclosure in the notes to financial statement. So kailangan kasing i-disclose na yung property, plant, and equipment na yun ay included sa right of use asset. Depreciation of right of use asset. So paano nga ba natin i-depreciate yung right of use asset? So sabi sa standard, the lessee shall apply normal depreciation policy. Under IFRS 16 paragraph 32, the lessee shall depreciate the right of use asset over the useful life of the underlying asset under the following conditions. So unang condition ay yung transfer of ownership to the lessee at the end of the lease term. So ibig sabihin may transfer of ownership from the lessor to the lessee. Ibig sabihin parang naging rent to own. And then next naman is lessee is reasonably certain to exercise a purchase option. So ibig sabihin, desidido na si lessee na bilhin yung asset na yon. So kapag itong dalawang conditions na to ay na-meet, i-depreciate natin yung right of use asset over the useful life of the underlying asset. However, kapag hindi naman na-meet yung conditions na to, i-depreciate natin yung right of use asset over the useful life of the asset or the lease term kung ano yung mas maikli dun sa dalawa na yon. Ngayon naman, dumako tayo sa measurement of lease liability. So yung lease liability po, ito po yung mga financial obligations ni lessee kay lessor. Gaya nga ng sinabi ko kanina, may mga babayaran si lessee kay lessor. So para natin to i-measure. Under IFRS 16, paragraph 26, at the commencement date, kailangan daw i-measure ni lessee yung lease liability at the present value of lease payments. So natatandaan nyo ba na nabanggit ko na to kanina, itong present value of lease payments dahil kasama siya sa cost ng right of use asset. So paano ba natin ipi-present value yung lease payments? So lease payments shall be discounted using the interest rate implicit in the lease. So itong interest rate implicit in the lease ay ginagamit natin siya para ma-present value yung lease payments. And aside from that, ginagamit rin natin ito para yung present value ng lease payments at yung unguaranteed residual value ay mag-equal sa fair value ng underlying asset and initial direct costs ng lessor. So itong implicit interest rate ay ma-determine naman natin siya agad kasi naka-state siya sa problem, and kapag in actual naman ay ito yung kalakaran sa market. So kapag wala ito, ang gagamitin naman natin ay yung incremental borrowing rate. So kapag hindi natin ma-determine yung implicit interest rate, IBR yung gagamitin natin. Ano itong incremental borrowing rate? So ito yung interest rate na ipinapataw kay lessee kapag siya ay manghihiram or magbaborrow ng funds para ma-acquire yung similar asset over similar term with similar security. So ibig sabihin kapag si lessee ay manghihiram ng pera ng funds para ma-obtain yung similar asset na may similar term and similar security, ang gagamitin natin ay incremental borrowing rate kapag hindi determined yung interest rate implicit in the lease. So lagi nyo tatandaan yan at huwag kayong malilito na interest rate implicit in the lease yung unang-unang gagamitin kapag readily determined naman siya. Pero kapag hindi siya available, incremental borrowing rate. Components of lease payments. Una ay fixed lease payments. So from the word fixed, ibig sabihin hindi na nagbabago. Babayaran pa rin ito ni lessee kahit na anumang mangyayari. Then next naman ay yung variable lease payments. So from the word variable, ibig sabihin nagba-vary siya. So bakit siya nagba-vary or bakit siya nagbabago? Paano? So ito ay nagbabago dahil sa changes na nangyayari after the commencement date other than passage of time. So ibig sabihin kapag may pagbabagong nangyari at the commencement date na nakaapekto or makakaapekto doon sa lease payments na yon, ibig sabihin yung payments na yon ay variable lease payments. So tandaan nyo na itong variable lease payments ay nagbabago lamang kapag mayroong pagbabago at hindi dahil sa passage of time. The next naman is exercise price of a purchase option. So ito ay nangyayari lamang kapag si lessee ay desidido na mag-exercise ng option para i-purchase yung asset na yon. Ibig sabihin may plano siyang bilhin yon. So kaya tayo nagkakaroon ng exercise price of a purchase option. Pero kung wala namang plano si lessee na bilhin yon, wala rin naman tong exercise price of a purchase option. Next naman ay itong amount expected to be payable by the lessee under a residual value guarantee. So yung residual value guarantee, ito yung garantiya na ibinibigay ng mga party unrelated kay lessor na yung value ng asset ay nasa specified amount at the end of the lease term. So kapag naman unguaranteed residual value, ito yung portion ng residual value na kung saan si lessor ay hindi assured or ginagarantiya lamang ng mga party na related sa kanya. So itong amount expected to be payable by the lessee under a residual value guarantee ay conditional lamang dahil nangyayari lang ito kapag walang transfer of ownership or kapag hindi reasonably certain si lessee na mag-exercise ng purchase option. Last naman is itong termination penalty if the lease term reflects the exercise of a termination option. Ibig sabihin lang ito kapag merong termination option, ibig sabihin meron din tayong babayaran na termination penalties. Lease term. So itong lease term na to, ito yung non-cancelable period na kung saan si lessee ay may right to use the underlying asset na nag-include ng period covered by an option to extend the lease and period covered by an option to terminate the lease. So itong period covered by an option to extend the lease, ibig sabihin si lessee ay desidido na mag-extend or mag-exercise ng extension option. Ibig sabihin, hahabaan pa yung panahon na kung saan siya ay may right to use the underlying asset. While yung period covered by an option to terminate the lease, ibig sabihin si lessee ay desidido na i-terminate yung lease or mag-exercise ng termination option. Ibig sabihin, tapusin na. Disclosure. So, ipinapakita lang dito yung mga dapat nating i-disclose and self-explanatory naman na to, kaya madali lang. So, una yung depreciation charge for right-of-use assets by class of underlying asset, interest expense on lease liability, expense relating to short-term leases, excluding the expense relating to leases with a term of 1 month or less, low-value leases, excluding the expense relating to low-value leases with term of 1 month or less, variable lease payments not included in the measurement of lease liability, income from subleasing right-of-use assets, total cash outflow for leases, addition to right-of-use assets, carrying amount of right-of-use assets at the end of the reporting period by class of underlying asset, short-term leases or low-value leases accounted for as operating lease. So, tandaan kasi natin na nasa finance lease pa rin po tayo in the part of the lessee. Additional disclosure. So, kailangan din kasi natin mag-disclose ng additional quantitative or qualitative information na necessary para makatulong sa users ng financial statements na i-assess kung ano yung mga effect ng leases doon sa financial position, financial performance, and cash flows. So, kabilang dito yung the nature of the lessee's leasing activities, future cash outflows to which the lessee is potentially exposed that are not reflected in the measurement of lease liability, variable lease payments, extension option and termination option, residual value guarantee, leases not yet commenced to which the lessee is committed. Then last one is restrictions or covenants imposed. Para naman ma-apply natin yung mga terms na discuss ko kanina, lumako naman tayo sa mga illustrations. So una itong transfer of title to lessee. So basahin natin yung problem. On January 1, 2021, an entity leased a machinery for 4 years, which is the same as the useful life of the machinery at annual rental or fixed payment of 100,000 payable at the end of each year. Lease provides for a transfer of ownership of the underlying asset to the lessee at the end of the lease term. So, ibig sabihin, meron tayong transfer of ownership at the end of the lease term. So, present value computation, the present value of annual payment of 100,000 for 4 years is determined using a 12% implicit interest rate. So, ganito yung magiging computation niya. Present value is equal to 100,000 times present value of an ordinary annuity of 1 for 4 years at 12%. So 100,000 times 3.0373 and equals to 303,730. So paano nakuha yung 3.0373? So tignan niyo to ang nasa baba, yung formula na nilagay ko sa baba and then yung mga meaning ng mga naka-include sa formula na yon. So, ganito yung mangyayari kapag isinubstitute na natin yung mga information na nandoon sa problem. So, 100,000 bracket 1 minus open and close parentheses 1 plus 0.12 raised to negative 4 divided by 0.12. So, ang unang gagawin natin dyan ay 1 plus 0.12 equals to 1.12 raised to negative 4. So, yung magiging answer doon, i-deduct natin sa 1. And then, yung difference nun ay i-divide natin sa 0.12. And then, yung makukuha natin is 3.0373. So, ganun natin nakuha yung 3.0373 or yung present value of ordinary annuity. Then, ita-times natin siya or i-multiply natin siya sa 100,000 and then doon natin makukuha yung present value na 303,730. Para ma-record natin yung finance lease, ganito yung magiging journal entry natin. Right of use asset, debit 303,730, then credit lease liability 303,730. Depreciation of right of use asset. So nabanggit ko na to kanina, na-discuss ko na rin kung paano ba mag-depreciate ng right of use assets. In this case, dahil meron tayong transfer of ownership, gagamitin natin yung useful life of the underlying asset, which is 4 years. So ganito yung magiging entry natin. Depreciation, 75,932, and accumulated depreciation, 75,932. So ngayon naman, accounting for fixed payment. The annual rental or fixed payment of 100,000 shall be treated as payment for the principal lease liability and the interest thereon. So yung interest ay difference between the face amount of gross fixed payments of 400,000 and the present value of 303,730. So kapag dineduct natin yon, makukuha natin yung 96,270. So yun yung interest natin. So bakit naging 400,000 yung face amount ng gross fixed payments? Kasi di ba sinabi kanina na yung annual rental or fixed payment ay 100,000 at binabayaran siya at the end of each year. And ilang years siya binabayaran? 4 years. So kung i-compute natin yon, 100,000 times 4 equals to 400,000. So balik tayo sa interest. So yung interest na 96,270, i-recognize siya as an expense over the lease term following the effective interest method of amortization. So ito yung table of amortization natin. So yung 96,270 na yon ay mahahati pa into 4 years. So sa unang taon, makikita nyo dito sa interest part na December 31, 2021, ang interest natin ay 36,448. Then, nung 2022, 28,821, 2023, 20,280, and yung 2024, 10,721. So, bakit nga ba nagkaganon? So, itong interest na to ay nakuha natin by multiplying the implicit interest rate doon sa ating present value. So, kung i-compute nyo, 303,730 times 0.12, makukuha nyo ay 36,448. So, ganun din yung gagawin natin sa iba pang present value para makuha natin yung interest every year. Then, itong principal naman ay nakukuha natin by deducting the interest doon sa fixed payment na 100,000. While itong present value naman ay nakukuha natin by deducting the annual principal payment doon sa balance ng ating lease liability or yung sa present value part. So 303,730 minus 63,552 is equals to 240,178. So 240,178 minus 71,179 is equals to 168,999 and so on. Yun. So ganun lang siya nakukuha. Ito naman yung magiging journal entries natin for 2021 and 2022. Presentation. So, if a statement of financial position is prepared on December 31, 2021, the right of use asset would be reported as a separate line item under non-current assets. Ganito yung magiging presentation niya. Right of use asset, 303,730, then less accumulated depreciation, 75,932, and then makukuha natin yung carrying amount na 227,798. Then lease liability would be reported as partly current in the amount of 71,179 and partly non-current for the remaining portion of 168,999. So bakit naging 71,179? Dahil ito yung lease liability natin sa taong 2022. While yung 168,999 naman ay yung mga natitirang lease liability natin na babayaran natin sa taong 2023 and 2024. Next illustration, certain purchase option. So, tignan nyo maigi itong mga information na to. On January 2021, Lessee Company leased a machine with the following pertinent information. Lessee Company had the option to purchase the machine upon the lease expiration on January 1, 2031 by paying 500,000. So meaning si Lessee ay reasonably certain o decidido nang mag-exercise ng purchase option at the commencement date of the lease. The estimated residual value of the machine at the end of the 12-year useful life is 600,000. So para makuha natin yung total lease liability, ganito yung magiging computation niya. Present value of lease payments, 1 million times 5.65 equals to 5,650,000. Then present value of purchase option, 500,000 times 0.322, 161,000. And then if inad natin itong dalawang to, makukuha natin yung 5,811,000. So bakit 5.65 and 0.322 yung ginamit natin? So nakikita nyo dyan na yung implicit interest rate ay 12%. So ibig sabihin 12% yung gagamitin natin. So sa kapag compute ng present value of an ordinary annuity, ang ginamit natin ay yung 12% which is 5.650 and doon naman sa pangalawa ay 0.322. So magiging ganito naman yung journal entries natin for 2021. 1. To record the acquisition of the machinery under a finance lease. Right of use asset, 5,811,000. Then credit lease liability, 5,811,000. Pangalawa naman, to record the first rental payment on December 31, 2021. Debit interest expense, 697,320. Debit lease liability, 302,680. Then credit cash, 1 million. So bakit naging ganyan? Kasi yung interest expense natin, nakuha natin to by multiplying the 12% sa 5,811,000 which is yung ating lease liability. So makukuha natin yung 697,320. So itong lease liability naman na to na 302,680, nakuha lang natin to by deducting yung interest expense doon sa ating annual payment na 1 million. And pangalawa, lease liability, January 1, 2021, 5,811,000. Payment on December 31, 2021, 1 million. Deduction natin is yung interest na 697,320. Then makukuha natin yung 302,680. Then 5,811,000 less 302,680 is equals to 5,508,320. And ayun yung lease liability natin for December 31, 2021. To record the annual depreciation, 434,250, then accumulated depreciation to 434,250. So paano natin nakuha yan? So yung accumulated depreciation ay nakuha dahil sa 5,211,000 divided by 12 years. Dahil yung useful life ng ating machine ay 12 years. While yung depreciable amount naman is 5,211,000. So bakit naging ganun? Kasi yung cost ng right of use asset natin is 5,811,000. Ide-deduct natin doon yung residual value na nabanggit kanina which is 600,000. Kaya siya naging 5,211,000. So ito yung table of amortization. Katulad lang din to nung na-discuss ko kanina sa nakaraang illustration. Exercise of the purchase option. So di ba kanina nabanggit na si Lessee Company ay may planong mag-exercise ng purchase option. So if accounts are properly posted, the table of amortization will show the balance of the lease liability on December 31, 2030 at 500,000 equal to the purchase option. When the purchase option is exercised on January 1, 2031, which is the lease expiration, the journal entry to record the payment is debit, lease liability 500,000 and credit cash 500,000. So, ibig sabihin, kapag na-exercise yung purchase option sa January 1, 2031, ganito yung magiging journal entry natin. However, if the purchase option is not exercised, a loss is recognized equal to the difference between the carrying amount of the right of use asset and the lease liability on January 1, 2031. So, ganito yung magiging journal entry natin. Debit accumulated depreciation, 4,342,500. Debit lease liability, 500,000. Then debit loss on finance lease, 968,500. And credit right of use asset, 5,811,000. So bakit naging 4,342,500 yung accumulated depreciation? So di ba nga sabi ko kanina yung tamang pagde-depreciate ng right of use asset ay over the useful life of underlying asset kapag may transfer of ownership or kapag si lessee ay reasonably certain to exercise a purchase option. So dito non-exercise of purchase option. So ibig sabihin gagamitin natin kung ano yung mas mababa sa lease term or doon sa useful life ng asset. So in this case ang mas mababa is yung lease term which is 10 years. So 434,250 times 10 years is equals to 4,342,500. Then ito namang loss on finance lease, ganito yung naging computation niya. Right of use asset 5,811,000 less accumulated depreciation 434,250 times 10 years 4,342,500. So yung carrying amount on January 1, 2031 ay 1,468,500. Then less the lease liability ng January 1, 2031 which is 500,000. Makukuha natin yung loss on finance lease na 968,500. So, ayun lamang yung part ko dito sa report na to and let's now proceed with Rizel.
Hi everyone, I'm Rizel Ann Espiritu and I will be discussing the continuation of Chapter 10, which is about lessee accounting. Now to continue with our discussion, let us proceed to residual value guarantee and how it affects our lease accounting. So, residual value guarantee, though it has already been discussed earlier, balikan po natin siya ng mabilisan lang. Residual value guarantee, it refers to the guarantee that is made to the lessor by a party that is not related to the lessor. So it is a guarantee na yung underlying asset natin, it will be at least the specified amount at the end of our lease term. Para mas maintindihan po natin ang residual value guarantee, let us move on the illustration given. So on January 1, 2021, Easy Company leased an equipment with the following information. Fixed annual payment at the end of each lease year, 1 million. Lease term 4 years. Useful life of equipment is 5 years. Implicit interest rate is 10%. And then here's the present value of an ordinary annuity of 1 for 4 periods at 10%. Here's the present value of 1 for 4 periods at 10%. Also, Easy Company guaranteed a 200,000 pesos residual value on December 31, 2024 to the lessor. Note, as long as there is a residual value guarantee, there is no more purchase option because the equipment shall revert to the lessor upon the expiration of the lease on December 31, 2024. Automatically po, pagka meron po tayong residual value guarantee, hindi na po or wala na po tayong purchase option. Kasi, ibabalik po pa rin natin yung equipment sa lessor or the equipment shall revert to the lessor at the end or upon the expiration of the lease term. So let's now compute for the cost of right of use asset. In computing for the cost of right of use asset and lease liability, pagka meron po tayong residual value guarantee, kailangan po natin siyang i-add up pa doon sa present value ng ating lease payments. So to do that, kailangan din natin i-compute muna yung present value ng ating residual value guarantee. So 200,000 times 0.683, we would have 136,600. And then i-add natin yun sa present value of lease payments natin. It would give us an equivalent of 3,306,470 for our cost of right of use asset and lease liability. Now let's look at our table of amortization for the given illustration. So as we can see, as of January 1, 2021, we have a present value or a lease liability of 3,306,470. Now, on December 31, 2021, we made a payment of 1 million. Pero we know naman na yung 1 million na yun, hindi siya kakaltas lahat ng yun sa ating present value or sa ating principal value. Kasi meron pa pong interest doon. And yung interest ay, yun yung parang tutubuin ng lessor sa pagpapalease sa atin. So, bali to compute po kung magkano lang yung kakaltas sa ating principal value, we have to compute muna for our principal payment. To do that, we would deduct our interest expense of 330,647 to our payment, and then it would give us a value of 669,353, and ito lang po yung applicable na ikakaltas sa ating preceding value of 3,306,470. So therefore, as of January 1, 2021, our lease liability of 3,306,470 would be deducted by our principal payment of 669,353, and then it would give us a lease liability for December 31, 2021 equivalent to 2,637,117. So question, paano po tayo nag-come up with the interest expense? So to compute for the interest expense, ang gagawin lang po lagi ay i-multiply yung preceding present value sa atin pong interest rate. So in our case, 10%. So nung minultiply po natin itong preceding present value natin ng 3,306,470 by 10%, it gave us a value of 330,647, and that serves as our interest expense. So the same process will go on and on until the end of our lease term. Now let's move on to the journal entries to record the acquisition of the equipment, debit right of use asset, and credit lease liability. To record the first annual payment on December 31, 2021, debit interest expense, debit lease liability, and credit cash. To record the annual depreciation, debit depreciation, and credit accumulated depreciation. Now, the depreciable amount is equal to 3,306,470, which is our cost of right of use asset minus the residual value guarantee of 200,000. So, of course, before po tayo nag-come up with our annual depreciation of 776,617, nag-compute muna po tayo for our depreciable amount. And when it comes to computing for the depreciable amount, pagka meron po tayong residual value guarantee, deduct po natin ito sa ating cost of right of use asset. And the answer for that would serve as our depreciable amount. And then, so in this case, our depreciable amount is 3,106,470, and then we divided it by 4 because that is our lease term. Now, bakit po by 4? Bakit by lease term? The answer to that is because the asset is depreciated over the lease term because there is neither a transfer of title nor a reasonably certain purchase option. Pero what if may transfer of title po tayo or if may reasonably certain purchase option po tayo? Therefore, yung asset po natin, i-depreciate po natin siya over its useful life. Pero since wala nga po, dahil may residual value guarantee tayo, edi i-depreciate po natin siya over its lease term. Now, on the return of equipment to lessor on December 31, 2024, ito po yung mga journal entries natin. So, to record the final annual payment on December 31, 2024, debit interest expense, debit lease liability, and then credit cash. To record the return of the equipment to the lessor, debit accumulated depreciation, debit lease liability, and credit right of use asset. Note, observe po that the residual value guarantee is not paid by the lessee to the lessor. So, this is because, yung liability po ng ating residual value guarantee, it is already satisfied by returning the equipment to the lessor. So, yung act po mismo ng pag-return ng equipment sa lessor, it already satisfies yung liability ng residual value guarantee. So, wala na tayong kailangan pang bayaran na residual value guarantee sa ating lessor. So, the remaining carrying amount of the asset should equal the residual value guarantee. So, in this case po, if you could remember, dun sa ating table of amortization, sa end ng ating lease term, meron pa tayong natitirang 200,000. So, that is our remaining carrying amount. And it's equivalent din po sa ating residual value guarantee na 200,000. So, nasunod po ang statement na to. However, if the fair value of the underlying asset is less than the residual value guarantee, a loss is reported for the difference and the lessee must make up for the difference with a cash payment. However naman, if yung fair value po natin at the end of the lease term ay mas mababa sa ating sa ating residual value guarantee, therefore, kailangan po natin as lessee bayaran yung difference nun with cash payment and kailangan din natin itong i-report as a loss. So, for example po nun, our fair value as of December 31, 2024 is 150,000. Pero ang residual value guarantee natin ay 200,000. So, sa madaling salita, ang residual value guarantee natin ay mas mataas sa ating fair value. So, paano iyon? If that's the case, an additional entry to record the loss is necessary. To record it, we would debit loss on finance lease, equivalent dun sa difference po ng ating residual value guarantee and fair value, so 50,000, and then credit cash, 50,000. Note, if the fair value is higher than the residual value guarantee, no additional entry is necessary because there is no cash settlement. Now, let's move on to initial direct cost. Yung initial direct cost naman po, these are costs that are incurred by the lessee upon obtaining the lease. So, example po nun could be yung commission, yung bayad ng commission sa agent na nakatulong sa pag-obtain ng lease. So, illustration, on January 1, 2021, simple company leased an equipment with the following information. So, ito po yung information natin. Meron po tayong annual fixed payment in advance at the beginning of each lease year na 1 million, initial direct cost paid na 250,000, lease incentive received 150,000, residual value guarantee 300,000, lease term 5 years, useful life of equipment is 6 years, implicit interest rate is 8%, and then ito po yung present value of an annuity of 1 in advance at 8% for 5 periods, and then here's our present value of 1 at 8% for 5 periods. So, to compute for the cost of right of use asset, let's first compute for our lease liability as of January 1, 2021. So, to compute for it, add po natin ng present value ng ating rentals and ang present value ng ating residual value guarantee since meron po tayong residual value guarantee. Upon adding it would give us an equivalent of 4,516,280 as our lease liability. After that, i-add po natin doon ang ating initial direct cost and then i-deduct naman ang lease incentive received to come up with our cost of right of use asset equivalent to 4,616,280. It's important to take note po na in computing the lease liability, hindi po natin isasali doon ang initial direct cost and ang lease incentive received. Pero in computing for the cost of right of use asset, kailangan po kasali ang initial direct cost and ang lease incentive received. So also, the initial direct cost is added and the lease incentive received naman po is deducted in computing the cost of right of use asset. So, again, initial direct cost, 250,000, and then minus our lease incentive received of 150,000. It would give us a net cash payment at the start of the lease equivalent to 100,000. Here's our table of amortization for the given illustration. Makikita po natin na on the same date of January 1, 2021, we made a payment or an advanced payment of of 1 million, and makikita rin natin na wala po itong interest expense. So therefore, yung payment natin, napunta lahat ng iyon or kumaltas lahat ng iyon sa ating principal value. Here are our journal entries for 2021 to record the acquisition of the equipment under a finance lease, debit right of use asset, credit lease liability, and credit cash. As for our cash, ang nilagay po natin dito ay yung net cash payment po natin at the beginning of the lease, which is 100,000. Next, to record the first payment on January 1, 2021, debit lease liability, and credit cash. To accrue the interest for 2021 on December 31, 2021, debit interest expense and credit accrued interest payable. So since nag-a-advance po tayo ng ating payment for the year, therefore yung interest po natin ay i-accrue po natin. Now, to record the depreciation for 2021, debit depreciation, and then credit accumulated depreciation. To compute for the depreciation, ang ginawa po natin ay dineduct natin yung residual value guarantee natin na 300,000 sa ating cost of right of use asset na 4,616,280, which gave us a depreciable amount of 4,316,280, and then divide natin ito by its lease term of 5 years because, then again, we have a residual value guarantee, meaning wala po tayong purchase option. Here are our journal entries for 2022. To record the second payment on January 1, 2022, debit accrued interest payable, debit lease liability, and credit cash. To accrue the interest for 2022 on December 31, 2022, debit interest expense and a credit accrued interest payable. To record the depreciation for 2022, debit depreciation, and then credit accumulated depreciation. Next, again, as of our lease expiration po, on January 1, 2026, it turned out na meron po tayong fair value. Ang fair value po ng ating underlying asset ay 400,000 pesos. However, our guaranteed residual value is 300,000 pesos. Meaning, mas mataas ang ating fair value kaysa sa ating guaranteed residual value. So, ano pong gagawin natin in this case? So, in such a case, the equipment is simply returned by the lessee to the lessor. So, wala po tayong ibang kailangan pang gawin, kundi as lessee, kundi ibalik ang equipment sa lessor. And then, you would record for our journal entry, debit accumulated depreciation, debit lease liability, debit accrued interest payable, and credit right of use asset. So yung excess po na 100,000 of the fair value over the residual value guarantee, it is not accounted for by the lessee because there is no cash settlement. So na-explain ko na rin po ito earlier, if mas mataas ang ating fair value kaysa sa ating guaranteed residual value, wala po tayong kailangang bayaran, hindi na po natin kailangan pang gumawa ng additional entry. Now, let's move on to unguaranteed residual value. So, unguaranteed residual value, it is a portion po ng residual value that is not guaranteed. Or, if guaranteed man po, it is only guaranteed po by a party that is related to the lessor. So, our illustration in here, we have, on January 1, 2021, SZ Company leased a warehouse with the following information. So, we have an annual rental payable at the end of each year na 600,000, and guaranteed residual value na 200,000, payment to lessor to obtain a long-term lease, 224,000, cost of restoring the asset as required by the contract, 634,920, annual executory cost paid, 50,000, lease term of 6 years, useful life of equipment is 8 years, implicit interest rate is 10%, discount rate for the restoration cost is 8%, present value of an ordinary annuity of 1 at 10% for 6 period is 4.36, present value of 1 at 10% for 6 periods is 0.56, and present value of 1 at 8% for 6 periods is 0.63. So, additional info, the lessor provides for neither a transfer of title to the lessee nor a purchase option. So, wala po tayong transfer of title, wala po tayong purchase option. Thus, the equipment shall revert to the lessor upon the expiration of lease on January 1, 2027. To compute for the total cost of right of use asset, we would add our lease liability, the payment to lessor to obtain a long-term lease, and yung present value ng ating restoration cost. So, we would come up with a total cost of right of use asset equivalent to 3,240,000. Here are important key points to remember. So first, the present value of the residual value is not included in the lease liability because it is guaranteed. So in computing for the lease liability, hindi po natin isasali pa ang present value ng residual value. Unlike dun sa if guaranteed po ang ating residual value, talagang sinasali natin yung present value ng residual value para po sa pag-compute ng ating lease liability. Pero in this case, since unguaranteed siya, hindi natin siya isasali. Second, the restoration cost must be required by contract or law and included in the cost of right of use asset at present value. So, dapat po daw na ang restoration cost natin ay required by contract or law, which is in this case, yes, it is required by contract. Next, the annual executory cost is treated as outright expense. Yung annual executory cost, yun po yung ownership cost natin, yung maintenance, yung insurance, yung taxes, it is treated as an outright expense. Next, here are our journal entries for 2021. To record the acquisition of the warehouse under a finance lease, debit right of use asset, credit lease liability, credit cash, credit estimated liability for restoration. To record the payment of executory cost, debit executory cost, and credit cash. To record the first rental payment on December 31, 2021, debit interest expense, debit lease liability, and credit cash. To record the depreciation for 2021, debit depreciation, and credit accumulated depreciation. Now, in this case, again, yung depreciation natin, it is based on the lease term because there is neither a transfer of title nor a purchase option. Also, it's important to take note na ang unguaranteed residual value po natin, yung unguaranteed residual value po natin, it is ignored in computing the depreciable amount. Unlike if guaranteed po yung residual value natin, di ba sinasali po talaga natin, or ang ginagawa po natin if guaranteed yung residual value natin, dinededuct po natin yon sa ating cost of right of used asset para po ma-compute natin yung ating depreciable amount. Pero since unguaranteed po yung residual value natin, we would just ignore it. Hindi po natin yung papansinin sa pag-compute ng ating depreciable amount. Next, to record the interest on the liability for restoration cost for 2021, debit interest expense, and credit estimated liability for restoration. Now, on the return of equipment to the lessor, on January 1, 2027, the return of the warehouse to the lessor is simply recorded. So, debit accumulated depreciation and then credit equipment. So, this same journal entry, it is made regardless of whether the fair value of the asset is higher or lower than the estimated unguaranteed residual value. So, it doesn't matter kung mas mataas or mas mababa po ang ating fair value kaysa sa ating unguaranteed residual value kasi nga po unguaranteed ito. Therefore, the lessee has no financial obligation but to return the underlying asset to the lessor. Next, payment naman po ng liability for restoration cost. On January 1, 2027, the carrying amount of the estimated liability for restoration cost would be 634,920 pesos after recognizing interest for 6 years using the effective interest method. So, in this case, the liability is simply the recognized upon payment for the restoration cost. Debit estimated liability for restoration and credit cash. Now, let's move on to the actual purchase of underlying asset. So, entities po, there is a possibility for entities to purchase an underlying asset that it has been leasing on. So, if po na under ito ng finance lease. So, yung cost naman ng asset purchase na in this case, it is equal to the carrying amount of the leased asset plus cash payment minus the balance of the lease liability. So, for example, an entity purchased an equipment that it had been leasing under a finance lease for 4 million pesos. The balances of certain accounts on the date of actual purchase were right of use asset 5 million, accumulated depreciation 1,500,000, lease liability 3,800,000. Our journal entry is debit equipment, debit accumulated depreciation, debit lease liability, credit right of use asset, credit cash, and its equivalents. So to compute naman po for the cost po ng ating equipment, here's what we would do. So first, we would compute for our carrying amount. To compute for our carrying amount, let's subtract the accumulated depreciation to the right of use asset. So 5 million minus 1,500,000, it would give us a carrying amount equivalent to 3,500,000. And then let's add the cash payment made, which is 4 million. So it would give us a total consideration of 7,500,000. And then let us subtract or minus the lease liability equivalent to 3,800,000, it would give us the cost of equipment actually purchased equivalent to 3,700,000. So yep, this marks the end of Chapter 10, Lessee Accounting. We hope that you have learned from our discussion, from our reporting, and again, thank you so much for watching.